Hey guys, I am Ian K, and in this video I'm gonna do something a little different from my Clan Boss showcases. So I'm gonna be just going through the top 8 champions that I think needs a buff and what I think or my idea of a buff that can make those champions at least viable. So first of all, why top 8? Because initially I wanted to kind of make like a list of each champion, one champion in each faction, like the worst champion in each faction, and uh, what buffs do I needed to make them viable. But then after going through all the champions, I realized that on some of the factions, all of the champions are actually in a pretty decent spot. So some factions didn't have any champions that I think needed a buff. So only a few of them do, and as in the video we have top 8, so there were only 8 factions where I think that have a champion that needed a buff in each of those factions. So that's how we got to top 8. Um, and the second of all, I wanna, I guess, classify what exactly do I mean by a champion that needed buff, like a bad champion. How do I rate what a bad champion is? So for me, a bad champion is for players where, let's say, a new early to early mid game player, if a player at that level pulls that specific champion and that champion straight away goes into the vault where the champion absolutely have no use for that level of account, that level of player, that is what I classify as a bad champion. Where even a player that are still using their starter champions on a few rares, the legendary champion that they pull have absolutely no value to their account. That is how I classify a bad champion. All right. So let's start with the list. So I'll be going in order. The first faction that I will go is Bannerlords. So in the Bannerlords, I think that out of all this champion, the worst champion here is Minaya. So Minaya is a pretty terrible hero in my opinion, a terrible champion. So all she's a healer. She places continuous heal and she heals herself and one um, random ally, just a single target heal. So it's pretty bad heal, just a single target heal, and a pretty useless heal reduction debuff. The second heal, he heals all allies by 40% health, so this is a pretty decent skill except for the fact that it has this condition where it places a block debuff only if they have an increased defense buff. So, and then it's additionally it grants a shield if a heal is full. So this is a good skill. So it basically heals and provides a shield, but under two different conditions. So, and her passive is pretty, I guess, decent, but not really because she's going to be like your tankiest hero in the team. So it's very unlikely, tankiest champion in your team. So it's very unlikely that she will die. So, okay, so what I would do for Minaya is just remove the condition for one of the skills. And I think the condition that should be removed is this increased defense buff. So what this skill will now do is simply heals all allies by 40% of their health, then place a block debuffs, and then place a shield if they are fully healed. So it becomes kind of similar to what Warlord does, except with the condition that they have to be fully healed in order to get the shield, whereas Warlord doesn't need the condition to place the shield. All right, so that is for Minaya, which I think um, would make her at least usable as a support now and a healer, consistent healer. And I guess I also wanted to add that my kind of ideas to buff the champions is not to completely rework them. It's mainly to kind of support what they're already doing, to make them do what they're already doing better, as well as has more logic to their skill kit, rather than doing something like just halfway through. All right, so that's Minaya. So the next champion on the list for High Elves, so the champion that I think needed a buff here, to no surprise, is Pixnil. So Pixnil is a very specific niche champion revolving around her passive to steal freezes. But apart from that, I mean, I'm not going to really touch her niche here since this is something that she is unique to her. But apart from that, all her other abilities are also not that useful. So she places a Perfect Veil on your ally, and then she randomly freezes enemies on her A3, and then her A2 places increased defense and continuous heal on all allies. Then attack all enemies under freeze, and then places a weaken on enemies under freeze. So this skill basically does nothing except buff if there are no enemies under freeze. So my suggestion to buff Pixnil is simply to remove the condition to attack all enemies under freeze. So what this skill will now do is just place the buff and then attack all enemies. But then it will still apply the weaken only to enemies under freeze. So this skill will always, so she will always have an AoE attack in this skill. And apart from that, we also want to reorder. I also suggest reordering the skill to place the weaken first. So if there is enemies under freeze, they will get the weaken before Pixnil attacks them. So it slightly increases the damage that she does on the AoE. All right, so after that, I think this champion should be okay, should be usable, even if you don't really count for the passive freeze. So she's basically just a random freeze on enemies, and then she does her buff and an AoE attack as well. All right, so that's for Pixnil. So in the Sacred Order, so the champion here that I think needs the buff the most is probably one of the top three most boring champion in the game, and that is Eriel. So Eriel has a very simple kit. All it does is just single target damage with a little bit of extra wording to a skill. But one thing that has in common with all the skill is each of the skill has a extra 30% chance to crit. So he basically has an extra 30% crit rate. So this is kind of a hot take, I guess, I'm going to be his kit reworked and my buff suggestion is going to be a little bit more, but it's still going to be in line with what he currently does. So the first thing I would do is I would basically remove all the extra 30% chance to crit from all his abilities and give him a passive. So now he has a passive that basically gives him that 30% crit, and something extra that I add is that he is able to crit on weak hits. So whenever a champion weak hits, they do less damage. So they do 30% less damage, or whatever that amount is. So let's just say it's 30% less damage. So even if he does a weak hit and does 30% less damage, that damage can still crit. So he's still able to pump out damage, even though it's less damage, but it's still better than a weak hit. All right. The next thing that I would do is to give him a little bit more utility than just single target. So first thing I would do for his A3 is that he would still do the exact same thing where he steals all buff from the target and then attacks it. But now he also has a chance to AoE attack. So after attacking, he will also attack all other enemies that do not have any buff. So under certain conditions, if he can be your nuker, your go first nuker, where the enemy doesn't have any buff on them, then he can be an AoE. It can be an AoE attack. But if the enemy have buffs, basically he will guarantee to at least use this ability on one target. So this is so gives him a little bit of AoE potential. His second ability, I wouldn't change this, so this will still do the same thing. Hit 3 times and 50% chance to ignore defense. And for his A1, so now we have removed the 30%, moved it into his passive. It's basically just a single attack one enemy, which is pretty boring. So what I would suggest is just having him place an extra attack if the enemy does not have any buffs on them. So it's still in line with his no buff mechanic that does something extra on targets that have no buff. So, and it is also in line with this faction, which has champions that usually place an extra hit. So like constantly he has placed an extra hit if they have any debuff, and then Fennec also same thing, an extra hit if they have any debuffs. But for him, it's an extra hit if they have no buffs on them. So if they have no buffs, he will place an extra hit. So that's the idea I have in line for Errol. I think this kind of change would actually make him uh, usable for early game player and potentially even end game player. All right, so that's kind of like the biggest change that I'd suggest for the champion in my list, or one of the biggest, let's say. Next, we have the Barbarians. So for the Barbarians, actually, after looking through all the champions here, I don't think any champions here is quite useless. So a new player who pulls any of the champion here, the champions here will have use on their account. Next, Ogrins. Same thing with Ogrins. I think almost all the champions here have use for a new account, so I don't think any of the champion here needs a buff, in my opinion. Lizardmen, again, another faction that I think all the champions here have used for a new account. I would argue like Vergamkar is probably not that good, but for a new champion, he's still pretty decent. So that's which is why, after reading through his crit properly, I don't think he needs a buff. It's only when you're mid game where, which a lot of players are, that find that champion pretty bad. All right, next. Okay, now we have a champion here which I think needs a buff. Again, this is the one of the most boring champions in the game, the top three. One of them being Eriel. Now he's the second one, War Chief. So War Chief has a really boring kit. All he does is a single target provoke. He does some steal target buff, and then his reflect damage. So War Chief is a tricky champion to kind of buff because he is. The thing about War Chief is that his reflect damage passive is actually really strong on PvE content. When he is your enemy, when he has like a ton of stats, the reflect damage can actually be very deadly. But when you use him, he is useless because you don't get that level of stats. So it's kind of hard to balance him without kind of breaking him in PvE. So here's, I guess, my idea of buffing him without really breaking him in PvE is first of all to change his passive to still have the 60% reflect damage back to the attacker, but instead of this part which increases his defense by 15% for each dead ally, which is kind of nonsense to be honest. Like, why would you want your allies to die? So this part doesn't really come into effect. So what I'd suggest is to remove that part and give him a new part to this ability, which is similar to what Iron Brago does. So what it does now is that it gives all allies, including himself, 10% defense, 10% of his defense for each enemy that he provokes. So when he provokes an enemy, everyone in your team gets 10% of his defense, including himself. Then since his provoke lasts a long time for 3 turns, so he can provoke one enemy, and then he comes back to his turn to do his A1, and he provokes a different enemy. So there's two enemies under provoke, so your allies get 20% defense. So this is what I think could make him a little bit more unique and special without kind of breaking him. And then obviously the one thing that is bad about provoke is that it cannot be applied to bosses. So basically the passive of increasing defense will be negated there, except for the magma dragon, of course. But so to kind of give him a little bit more use in bosses, for his A2, it does the exact same thing, but it now places an extra hit if the provoke is not placed. So if when attacking bosses, so at least his A2 has a chance to do like higher damage, 2 hits instead of just 1 hit. All right, so that's how I think War Chief could be buffed to make him a little bit more usable. All right, next we have the Orcs. Again, another popular champion that has been buffed a couple times, but it's still completely useless, and that is Tila Gormain. So for Tila, I think kit should be a little bit reworked, but still kind of keeping in line with what her entire kit does. So first thing is her ability to kind of steal random buffs. What I think should happen is to remove this part from her A1 and make it into a passive. So she now has a passive that steals buff from targets whenever she places debuff on them. So if she does her HP burn on one target, then she will steal the buff there. If she does her AoE with 2 debuffs, so she will steal 2 random debuffs from any enemies that she placed these 2 debuffs on. So basically, whenever she plays the debuffs, she will steal buffs from them. And then now, since the stealing buff part of her A1 is gone, something should be added on the A1. So what I think is that her A1 now has the ability to, I guess this is a little wordy, but it now increases the duration of a random buff from the target that she attacks to 2 turns. So the buff now lasts 2 turns, But then after it increases to 2 turns, she applies the debuff spread and spread that debuff to all enemies. And then if that debuff is like a new debuff that places on that all the enemies, then she also steals the buff from them if they have buff. So it kind of synergizes her kit. So her kit revolves around placing debuffs and stealing buffs. So I think that is a little bit more useful than what her current kit does. So I hope that will be enough to make her at least a little bit more unique. So she can now be placing HP burn and then spreading that HP burn as well. So the combo from this ability. Instead of just giving her like a AoE HP burn, which clearly Plarium doesn't want to do. All right. Next we have Demonspawn. I think in the Demonspawn, all the champion here are pretty solid. None of them needs buff. All of them will be pretty game changing on any account, any new account. The Undeads, okay, this is a big faction, and there are a couple of champions that I think are bad here, but I think the champion that I think that needs a buff is Bloodgorged. So he has a very simple kit. Um, the Blanc Revive is pretty decent for arena, but it won't really help with progression. This AoE ability is also pretty decent, but it's only a single target cooldown, so which is random as well, so not really good. So what I suggest for upgrading Bloodgorge is a little pretty simple. So on his A2 ability, so what he does now, he does the exact same thing, place the target skills on cooldown, but this ability also does an extra hit if all the target skills are on cooldown. So if you think about a fight, right? So he will start with his A3 to try to kill someone. And then the enemy goes, each of the enemy use, let's say, one of their abilities. And then when he goes, he used this ability to place the cooldown on your enemy for their second skill that is on cooldown. So champions usually have two active skills. So so one of their skills are already on cooldown, and then you place their other skill on cooldown, and then you place an extra hit. So ability will be a big AoE nuke. So his current AoE has this ability has a multiplier of 4. So if this has a conditional ability to double hit, which will be one of the highest AoE damage in the game, but of course the condition is quite difficult to achieve, but it gives him potential to do a lot of AoE damage. All right, so this is what I'd suggest to make Bloodgorge, I guess, a bit more usable. Next, we have the Dark Elves. So for Dark Elves, the champion here I'd suggest is Queen Eva. I mean, when you pull a champion and the champion is going to be a campaign farmer, there's nothing worse than that. So when your starter can do it just as well. So for Queen Eva, her kit is a little bit, to me, it seems very out of place. It doesn't really synergize well with each other, but her brass ability is obviously the A3. So what I suggest to change is the A3 here is simply to, instead of decreasing the turn meter by 20%, she steals the turn meter instead. So she gets to her turn faster. So she can use this ability, steals 20% turn meter, so she reduces the enemy turn meter as well as gain turn meter. So if she kills the enemy, she can use this again and again and constantly reduce turn meter. So it's a little bit more CC ability. Reduce steal, so she'll be very fast in helping clear like dungeon waves. All right, so this is what I think would make her quite viable. And then next, we have the Knight Revenant. So champions here that I think is pretty bad is Narma. So Narma is like an all-out clan boss champion, really just single target, debuffs, some heals, and the relevant debuffs for the clan boss. But the thing about her is that a rare champion, Frozen Banshee, does as much, if not more, damage than her, and does not require all these legendary books. So she's a huge investment of legendary books for something that a rare champion can do. So that's really bad. So what I suggest to change Narma is a pretty, I guess, a rework on her kit. So first of all, I will be changing like her A1 ability to give her first a passive. So what her passive is that it will be kind of unique here. So whenever any uh, the duration of any debuff applied by Narma itself. So she has the decreased attack and poison sensitivity. So whenever it reduces duration, that means that whenever the clan boss takes a turn or something else, which I will describe later. So when they take a turn and the debuff reduces by one, there is a 50% chance for it to increase the duration by one first before reducing. So ultimately, it doesn't reduce the duration of the buff, it just procs once. If it's a poison, it just procs once. If it's any other debuff, like decrease attack, it basically doesn't reduce duration. So it decreases by one and then increases by one again. So it's a auto increase duration. But now to combo, I guess to synergize with that new passive is her A1 ability. So instead of increasing duration now, what her A1 does is that it has the ability to activate poisons. So it has a 40% chance to activate three poisons on the target. So when she attacks, she can activate the poisons to deal the poison damage, but then it synergizes with the passive. So when she procs it, she activates each of the poison has a chance to increase the duration by one to basically keep the poison amount the same. So this will help her do more damage. So instead of just um, uh, poison damage through the clan boss taking turns, she has the ability to activate poisons and then increase the duration. So the poisons, she would do more poison damage potentially than Frozen Banshee or any other poisoner like Cult Brawler, especially with counter attack. All right, so that's kind of the thought of change that I have for Narma. Next, and I think that's it actually, because for the dwarfs, I don't think any champion here needs a buff. All of them are good when pulled early. Same with Shadowkin. Shadowkin, that's also I think all the champions here are pretty good. And by the way, if you notice, I did not go over any of the void champions because I'm only going through the non-voids because obviously Jing1 is one of the worst void legendaries in the game, but I'm not going to talk about him here. So champions like Gamuran and Nobel, I actually think Nobel is a good champion for a CC, so I don't think he needs buffs. And Gamuran is also a pretty good support even if you pull him early. So yeah, I don't think any champions in Shadowkin needs a buff. Yeah, so those are the top 8 champions that I have through 8 different factions that I think are pretty weak, even for early game that will go straight to the vault, and how I would change them. Let me know what you guys think, or if you think there are any other champions that are really bad, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. All right, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.